Our next session is Enacting Impactful Research Methods in Our Educational Process and Practice, presented by Julie Neisler, who is a quantitative researcher with Digital Promise, and Megan Tesene, who is the director of the Personalized Learning Consortium with the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. So welcome to both of you, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Glad to be here today. As was just mentioned, we'll do a quick intro and give you a little bit more context on who we are. I'm Megan Tesene. I'm the director of the Personalized Learning Consortium at APLU. We are a research, policy, and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., working very closely with four-year public universities, joined here by my colleague, Dr. Julie Neisler.
Hello, thank you all for being here with us today. My name is Julie Neisler. I'm a quantitative researcher from Digital Promise. The joke in my family is that I showed up to college and then never left. So I've worked, in student activities, student affairs. I taught for a semester. Bless all of you who have stuck around longer than that. Worked in assessment and planning and accreditation. And we're excited to talk to you about some of the things we have learned. But so first, let's start with the issue that we're talking about today. We know that the status quo in these gateway courses, needs some work, right? We know that there are equity gaps and there are differences in how our students are achieving. And we know that this was pre-pandemic data, right? So this is 2018, 2019 data. And so we know that things have not gotten better. The pandemic has really, shown a lot of inequities that exist in our society, the digital divide, access to resources and support. And so the work that we are doing, that Megan's going to talk about, is to address this status quo and try and improve equity in our resources.
Thank you, Julie. So both APLU and Digital Promise, we are 2 of 12 network partners that are part of the Every Learner Everywhere network. And collectively, we are all very much committed to creating more equitable outcomes in higher education. One of the things that we've primarily focused on is digital learning technology, right? How do we integrate that into the classroom and on your campus in a way that is best in service of your students and your faculty and your campus community? We have a strong emphasis on equity and ensuring that our practices that we are working with campuses are really speaking to the needs of the students, all students, of course, but the students who most need it and have been, frankly, underserved and marginalized by higher ed institutions and more broadly. So really thinking about how can we support institutions to build capacities, but also understanding how do we best serve those students in terms of, the different types of policies and educational practices that are happening in the classroom with those students. Some of the things that we work with institutions are, evaluating, go back, Julie, real quick. Thank you. Evaluating, implementing and scaling digital learning technologies to see what are the best practices, how do we do that, and really focusing on what's working well, what's working not well, how do we improve this moving forward, work on course and curriculum design, again, teaching practices, and then support services, not only for students, but faculty as well, just making sure they're supported by their institutions to do the very hard work that you are doing every day on the ground. Now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So since 2019, Every Learner Everywhere has been working with a cohort of universities. We started with 10 institutions. In the fall of 2019, we grew that to 13 colleges and universities. And we worked very closely with those institutions you'll see listed at the bottom, focusing on Texas, Ohio, and Florida institutions. That really allowed us to work not only just in, with the individual institutions, but also in a way that was collaborative, cohort, and regional, giving us some opportunities, for instance, to work with Ohio institutions that are specific to things that are going on in the state of Ohio in terms of educational policy, and bringing institutions together, for instance, the community colleges that lead into those four-year institutions as well. We've primarily worked in adaptive courseware in the past, but we are now kind of branching out into digital technologies more broadly in the educational context. Thanks, Julie. So how do we work with institutions? The way that we've been doing it is very deep engagement with a focus on continuous improvement over time, understanding that teaching is a practice and a process. We are always learning, we are always refining, we're always trying to do better, and understanding what's working well in our classroom, what are our colleagues doing, how do we replicate that, how do we share that information with each other and grow that on our campuses. It's great if a faculty is doing amazing things in their one classroom. It'd be even greater if some of their colleagues were doing that too and learning from each other and really building communities. So we work with university cross-functional teams, often with faculty who are within the department collaborating together, but also making sure that they're supported by their institution more broadly. So making sure that they're working with their teaching and learning centers. They're also working with advising, student success. We really want to focus on how do we help institutions understand that this is not a job just for faculty. This is a community effort. What resources and different sort of supports exist on campus to support faculty to do this work in service of our students, especially focusing again on those equitable outcome components for our students as well. Thanks, Julie.
So what you have shown up here is talk about the research, right? And so instead of research where we think of, oh, I did a research project and I'm done and I found an answer and now I'm moving forward. We like to think of research as part of a continuous improvement process and sort of this cyclical thing where you're continuing to improve and continuing to get better because there's always work to do for improving equity. And so this is our continuous improvement cycle, and we're going to talk through these different steps with you and talk through what it looks like on college campuses and some resources you might think of to try yourself. But so the different steps, right? So we are going to, you identify your research questions, what do you want to know? What are you trying to figure out? Select your data points, you make decisions based on data. So, knowing what that data is going to come from, collecting and analyzing that data, determining what changes you're going to make, right? It's nice to know things, but then how do we improve student success with that information? Setting goals, right? We know that this work isn't one and done. So how are we going to track those changes that we've made and then implement changes and tracking progress over time? So first, when we think about identifying research questions, really to examine these learning objectives through an equity-minded lens. So as you think about learning objectives for your research or what you want to stand, think about, who really thinks about this course and knows what students are supposed to accomplish. So you as a teacher obviously have that expertise, but also working with peer instructors. Megan talked about that collaboration across units can be really supportive. Course leads, if there's a dean or department head, or even subject-specific professional organizations tend to have insights and know, what students should be learning in Bio 101, in Statistics 101. And then think about your learner characteristics. So, what are your demographics of your student population in terms of, do they work full time? Do you tend to have a lot of students who tend to be caregivers or veterans, and thinking about those different identities? And then also, what is the context of learning? And so how are students taking these classes? How are they accessing the content and material? So thinking through working with instructional designers and teaching and learning centers. And I know that I just listed many, many departments that tend to be siloed across campuses, but I think Megan might have some insights in terms of how important it is to really break down those silos and work together as a collaborative group and not just think about working within your individual classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've said it once, we'll say it again and again, collaboration. You don't have to work in isolation to do this work. Often teaching is taught or treated as an individual effort by faculty, but what we've really learned is most beneficial is taking a collaborative team-based approach, not only within your department, so talking to your colleagues who are also teaching the same course or the next course or the previous course, but really just talking about how things are going in the classroom and really engaging in a community of educators, having a sort of self-reflective kind of thinking in alignment about how are we teaching, what do we want our students to accomplish, how can we make sure that there's a seamless transition from one course to the next, that they know what they need to know for the next course. And in terms of research and evaluation, also thinking, kind of embedding that into your considerations from instruction. And how are you going to measure that? What sort of considerations are you going to have to ensure that your students do know what they need to know to go to the next stage? Also, how are you collecting information on how you are teaching these courses to assure that it's actually working, right? That your students are learning. And there's a bunch of folks on your campus listed here that you can talk to. Hopefully you've got, if you're fortunate, you've got, a robust teaching and learning center on your campus. We recognize that's not always the case. So there are resources out there. We'll have some information towards the end of the slide of where to go. We've got a lot of resources through Every Learner Everywhere about some of the different places that you can go if you don't have those resources on your campus. But I would first just say, reach out, talk to folks. Again, you don't have to do this work alone.
So once you've identified your question, there are things you want to know. Are students achieving my learning outcomes? Is there, when I disaggregate data, what does that look like? And so then thinking about what are your data points? How are you going to know that you've answered your question? So as we think about student learning, it's important to use both early indicators in addition to end of semester outcomes. We tend to think of like, oh, let's think about grades and pass rates. But at that point, the student has either already passed or failed. So are there early indicators you can use for interventions to really reach out to those students and support that equitable learning from the get-go? Also consider data that's already held by your institution. Our IR data have data lakes that are just troves of resources, or data that's generated throughout the course. So working with an LMS system, our LMS systems now have advanced greatly and can produce pretty robust dashboards that can inform, what students are succeeding, what students are failing, what trends am I noticing? And then also data that you can collect. So you can ask, questions as an extra credit homework assignment. What did you learn best this week? What did you really struggle with this week? Sort of informing your teaching and learning, but then just gathering data as you think about this continuous improvement process. Again, I talked about dashboard data, collaborating with other offices, especially if you need access to that data. And then thinking again about both qualitative and quantitative data. As a quantitative researcher, I tend to jump pretty quickly to let's look at the numbers. But it's always important to remember those students' stories and those students' lives and experiences behind the numbers. So really thinking, what data can inform my research question? What students are reflected in that data? What students are possibly left out? And how do I adjust that to ensure that all of my students are represented? And then how am I working with that data throughout the semester?
Yeah, we have, so one of the institutions that we worked with really focused on integrating student feedback as being important, not just here are the numbers from the institution and also just straight course outcomes and DFW rates, but let's hear from our students. What sort of feedback and input do they have? You can do that within the semester and try and do some immediate modifications, but also end of the semester feedback beyond just typical course evaluations, which don't necessarily give you all the information that you need. So we worked with the University of Mississippi previously. They conducted focus groups with students who had been part of the project on adaptive courseware, basically asking them, how did it go? Are you learning? What are your thoughts on these tools in terms of, the teaching quality, all of these different things. So they were able to, I think they conducted 16 focus groups over the course of 2 academic years, learning that those students, had different insights on the adaptive courseware, did find that it was very helpful to them, but they said that it wasn't as helpful if it wasn't paired with quality implementation and teaching and feedback and engagement with the instructor. If you were lucky enough to join us for the previous session, we heard from some of our student fellows who are really speaking to that, being engaged with your faculty or instructor, feeling that your input has some sort of say in the type of what your educational experience is. The University of Mississippi used that information to not only provide that feedback to faculty to make adjustments to how they're designing the courses, but also the higher level programmatic efforts and the considerations that they were making in terms of technology adoption. So a bunch of different ways that we can collect that information, again, emphasizing the importance of the student experience and really getting their voices represented.
Yeah. So Megan talked about one way to gather data, right? Student focus groups. There are many ways to gather data. You can use in-class clickers, surveys with your students, extra credit questions on homework, in-class polls, ways to source anonymous feedback. Again, data that's maybe already been collected. So there's data all around us. So gathering that data and analyzing it, but there's some important things to consider. First, primarily is transparency with students about the purpose of the data and the use, right? So if you were asking students to provide you data, being transparent with them and say, hello, I would like this feedback to improve the class, to think about sequencing of the course, to figure out what assignments are more useful or less useful to your learning overall. And then, students really appreciate, students just talked about how much they appreciate, feeling heard. And so not only sharing back with them and saying, I'm gathering your data and I'm doing something with it, but then sharing back with them what you're doing with it and how you will make changes can really ensure that all students are feeling heard and can be something that's a class level wide implementation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is super time consuming for you. As you're thinking about analyzing the data, right, think about the skills and time necessary. We know qualitative data may take a little bit longer to analyze, seeking out those themes. Megan has a history. Megan's a qualitative researcher, is a quantitative researcher, right? So different skills are necessary. Also thinking about disaggregating to your data. So we know that just the overall average tends to benefit the majority. So really understanding what your different student groups and how are they successful, and what does that data look like specifically, for students who work full time, students who are caregivers, students who are repeating the course. What does that disaggregated data look like, and what is that experience for them? And again, who has represented the data and who is not? So we had one faculty member who said, every week during office hours, I take notes and I make changes based on their feedback, which is amazing. It's something we recommend definitely doing. But also not all students can attend office hours. Specifically, we have students who work full time, who are commuters, who are not able to show up at the specific time that's listed. Maybe not all students are reflected in those who can come to office hours. So thinking about what data are you getting and that you can make actionable, but then also how do you get data from the students who aren't showing up to those office hours, or who maybe aren't likely to fill out those extra surveys. And so figuring out, how are you make sure your data is representative so that when you are making changes, it is for the success of all students. Megan, anything to add?
I think you said plenty, and it was great. So you can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Thank you. Right. So then this is the big question, right? Once you have data, what do you do with it? And so there are 4 ways that we think about how you can use your data. So one is, what are you currently doing in the classroom? So if you are gathering data about active week to weeks, how students are learning, different modalities, is that something that you're going to use to change, what you do next week or next month in your class? Another way to think about it is how you think about your students and their learning. So if you're specifically setting up activities, group pair shares, study groups, and you think, oh, my students maybe learn best this way, but you may learn something from this feedback that changes how you think about that. And so one of the examples that we have from our institution is thinking about students who maybe are English language learners where English isn't their first language. And so the instructor was intentionally pairing students off based on multiple languages. And the student said, I actually really do much better when I'm paired with people who speak my native language, and I can explain these complicated statistics and algebra concepts in Spanish or in a different language, in French, for example. And so that really helped them succeed. So thinking about how you think about your students and their learning. Another example is, what will you do in the future, right? So if we think, okay, quiz 1, I gave quiz 1, this is what I've learned quiz 1. I've learned some things about it. You won't re-give quiz 1, but you will think about and do differently quiz 1 what you do in a next term. And then finally, how you talk about your classroom experiences. So what does it mean when you're thinking about asking for resources and support and who you're collaborating with? And so as long as the data, influences one of these things, it's really good direction. But then also, who will influence your selection of changes? So as you think about your data and determining what you're going to do, are you working with students, right? You've got this data from students. Are you working with them to help interpret what this data means, or what changes you meant? Are you working with peer instructors? Do you have course leads or deans or department heads? Are there some systemic changes that you want to implement? And so Megan, again, we'll probably talk about collaboration and a few examples of how this works really well. But you should not be, it's important to collaborate with others when deciding changes that you make, because we know things don't work best in a silo, and you may bring your own bias into how you interpret your data. Yeah. Megan, got a good example study for us?
One thing I just want to add is that this, oftentimes when we're on institutions, kind of go over all of these different things, it can be overwhelming because it's a lot and there's so much data. Where do I go? Where do I start? What should I focus on? And I would say start where you're at and start simple. Like, what are the things, like what's, the core problem that you're trying to solve, what data is available for that, and start there and chunk it. You don't have to do everything at once. And especially if you're trying to determine, efficacy and impact, it's a lot easier when you're focusing on one thing and one change to be able to determine if your changes are going to be effective. The other thing I would say is addressing to the administrators is that oftentimes in terms of our implementation efforts, we don't always see an immediate impact or change in terms of student outcomes or lower DFW rates. Certainly not in one semester. It's happened if you've got a really awesome model and faculty member, but it usually takes some time. So just showing some grace to your faculty and, giving them the support and encouragement to try innovation in the classroom and not be deterred by that.
So Megan talked about, right, it takes some time to see these changes. but set measurable goals. If you are making an intervention, if you make a change, and, say you want to flip your classroom and, oh, I want to measure a thing. How long do you expect to see the impact of that? And so again, before implementing changes, work with others. We're running short of time, so I'm talking a little faster. Consider the possible changes from multiple perspectives, and then use those different perspectives to set goals for improvement, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be improved DFW rates. It could be just increased engagement. It could be that everyone this week turns in their assignment on time. And then for the next one, right, once you implement the changes, you've decided what you're going to do, and then you implement them, you know what you're going to track. So again, communicate the changes you have made and why to students, that transparency. Meet regularly with stakeholders to discuss the status of those changes, right? So again, you're working with others on your campus and say, we're trying this new thing. Here's our intervention. We're improving success. This is what we're seeing so far, and this is the trajectory, the progress that we're making. And then consistently track progress, right? You don't want to say, I changed this thing, and then get to the very end. And then all of a sudden you have no data to show. So how are you tracking that progress? And then once you gather data, you've made the change and you've tracked your progress, you start over again, right? Because this is a continuous process that you're going through. And then with 8 minutes left, we are going to wrap up and be available for any of your questions. Yes. Sorry, we're both pretty chatty.
Julie.
Yeah, so we're here.
That's a lot to cover in 20 minutes. So applause to you anyway. That was great. So we do have some questions in here, and I'm going to start with one that just is sitting at the top. I think it's really important. But how can we plan to do this, use data, inform our instruction with data in a way that feels manageable? I know you started touching on it there at the end, but it can be easy to get overwhelmed when it's like, oh, change this quiz and change that thing and add this thing. So what would be your tips for kind of going about it in a manageable way?
My advice always is go for the low-hanging fruit. And making one change at a time, right? So you don't want to change a whole bunch of things, and you don't want it to feel overwhelming. So really identifying possibly one thing that you want to change, one thing you want to do, and then working on that for the semester. We have Michelle Hampton, who is a colleague that we present with and collaborate with a lot. And she says every semester she just makes one change, but she's been doing it for, 20 semesters. And so we see this iterative and change and improvement over time. So I would say pick one thing that you want to work on in that semester, and then keep improving over time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then also just say, because in terms of the action, like make one modification, but continue to have those conversations with your colleagues and faculty about what's the big picture here, what are the significant problems, not only in, say, this course, but this program that students are facing. That way you can you have like a goalpost that you're also aiming forward and somewhere you're wanting to get, while also considering, what's actually happening real time in the classroom. Maybe you make a change and then a new problem pops up, or a new issue, or something goes really well and you're like, wow, that was awesome and I wasn't expecting it. And basically reacting in real time to how those changes are affecting yourself and your students, and responding to that, and evolving your research questions, and evolving your plan and changing it. Just because you drafted something out at the beginning, this is what we're going to do, maybe that wasn't the best approach. So just being open-minded and, again, collaborative.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah. And just a reminder to the audience too, if you do have questions, the Q&A tab over there on the left, and they'll come right to us. But one that is also posted that I'm curious about, and you just mentioned it, you teed it up perfectly, Megan, but for collaboration. So I'm curious, how do we go about building structures for collaboration when we're sometimes working in systems that were never built to collaborate, right? Like the traditional faculty role, that line has been kind of a very individualistic line for a long time. So do you have any examples that you've seen of people building those teams and those collaborative experiences?
Yeah, I would say, well, and we've been fortunate enough that, the projects that we've worked on, we've already kind of had like leads and kind of those key innovators on campus who are really excited about this work are already kind of teed up for that. So I would say if you are an individual faculty member and you feel like you're hitting a wall maybe in your department or in your program, I would say start looking a little bit more broadly, whether it's at your own campus or whether it's at other institutions, like in learning from, other folks in your discipline that are doing work that you find inspiring. picking up the phone. Some people still do that and call people and start asking questions. But in terms of your campus, I would say thinking about like who on your campus is around that's supposed to be in service of you as a faculty member, talking to your teaching and learning staff, talking to the instructional designers, talking to student support services and the other folks that you know are kind of involved in that work, and starting those collaborative relationships and conversations, because you're going to also find out who else is kind of involved in that process as well. And then, of course, many of these programs, teaching and learning centers have, workshopping, training series. I'd say get involved. Find out what's going on your campus and start showing up. Also, thinking about, what's available online. So many things are virtual these days, maybe by force initially, but it's going to stick around post-COVID, I think. Events like this, other types of things where you are able to connect with people, start having conversations. I think that, one of the most inspiring things, and one of the things we've heard from faculty as well as the project leads on the projects we've been doing, is that peer-to-peer mentorship and collaboration. Like that's been some of the most where you have those, you come away from those sessions or those meetings feeling really good and jazzed up about, hey, someone's just as geeky about this stuff as I am. And I had a really good conversation with them. Or I was chatting with a history professor, and maybe I'm a biology professor, but they were doing something really cool and I want to try something like that. So, I'd say reach out. And if you have questions about who to reach out to, again, start small on your campus. And then we do have some resources on our site as well about how you might want to approach that and who those key places and point people on your campus might be, so you know where to get started.
I would say my advice is identify overlapping goals that you both have. So an example of one campus that we worked with, was like, okay, we're going to implement this to adaptive courseware, but we think students are really going to struggle with this and they're going to need extra tutoring. So they preemptively reached out to the tutoring center and said, hello, we'd love to collaborate you on this project that we're working on. And the tutoring center said, that's amazing. We students just show up and we have no idea what to expect with the kind of help that they want. But the fact that they could preemptively, here's the courseware, here's what we're working in, here's to get an idea of what students are struggling with. And so that way, the overlapping goal of I want to help students succeed specifically in this courseware, provided an avenue to say, okay, we should both commit time and energy to making sure that we are seamless across our two services of what I teach in the classroom and the tutoring support that you get, from peers, from other tutors. And so that aligned goal really helped, free up the resources to say, this is something we should be doing, so let's do it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, we are at just over a minute left, so I don't want to ask any more big questions. But there is one thing that I feel like is sitting out there that's kind of an underlying assumption, or not an assumption, but it seems to take a lot of vulnerability to do this work, right? To actually take data and feedback from students, which, as someone put in the Q&A, can sometimes come off a little intense, right? And to then change your course as a result of that. So we have 1 minute. I don't know if either one of you have comments on that, but it was kind of a theme I saw, was this, like, we take in data, sometimes it can be harsh, and how do we filter through what's just fluffy and what's harsh and what's helpful? With 45 seconds, I recognize I just asked you that, but.
Yeah, I would just, I'll let the data person speak real quickly, but I'll just say, give yourself some grace and be gentle with yourself. It's not necessarily personal. Many of the problems that our students are facing are systemic. And so really acknowledging that reality rather than, avoiding the data because it tells you something that, feels bad. Well, it feels bad to the students too, as well as to the faculty who maybe don't have the supports they need. So, acknowledging that and then start having those conversations about what do we do to solve these problems?
Yeah. In my 19 seconds, right, I'm going to harken back to my last point of overlapping goals. So your goal and the student's goal is for them to learn and grow and develop. And so keeping that in mind, that everything that you do and that they do is both this endeavor. And so, it's not necessarily a criticism of, something, it's a suggestion for improvement. So again, keeping that in mind, student success, equity. Yes.
Yeah, lots of factors. Well, thank you. We are a little bit over time. So once again, thank you to both Julie and Megan for being here today.